Daniel Day-Lewis won 3 Academy Awards for Best Actor. That record has never been matched. He was nominated 6 times, delivered performances critics still call untouchable, and reached a level of mastery most actors never approach once in a lifetime. And then in 2017, he erased himself. No scandal, no addiction, no failure. The most perfect actor alive didn't collapse. He simply chose to disappear before perfection finished breaking him. At his absolute peak, Daniel Day-Lewis was no longer measured against his peers. He was measured against the limits of the art itself. In 1989, My Left Foot brought him his first Academy Award. He didn't portray paralysis. He absorbed it, carried it, and refused to step away from it even when the cameras stopped rolling. The industry praised the authenticity. Few asked what it cost to sustain it. In 2007, There Will Be Blood arrived and reset the scale. The performance was not loud. It was controlled, surgical, and merciless. Critics stopped ranking actors and started declaring absolutes. The second Academy Award followed, and with it, a new expectation that Daniel Day-Lewis would always go further than he had before. Then, in 2012 came Lincoln. The restraint, the stillness, the disappearance into history. A third Academy Award, a record unmatched, 3 wins, 6 nominations, complete validation. From the outside, this looked like mastery perfected. From the inside, the equation turned dangerous. Each role now had to justify the legend behind it. There was no space left for exploration, no tolerance for imperfection, no permission to step back. Perfection stopped being a pursuit and became a requirement. The audience saw greatness. The industry saw history. But behind the silence, a question began to grow louder. When every performance must exceed the last, how long can any human being survive without breaking? Long before the awards and the silence, Daniel Day-Lewis grew up in an environment where standards were never shouted, but always felt. He was born in 1957 in London, into a household shaped by language, discipline, and expectation. His father, Cecil Day-Lewis, was a celebrated poet who would later become Poet Laureate of the United Kingdom. Words carried weight there. So did judgment. Excellence wasn't demanded explicitly, but it was implied in every room. From the outside, it looked like culture and privilege. From the inside, it felt like pressure without relief. Daniel was a quiet child, observant and inward, acutely sensitive to atmosphere. He noticed tone before content, silence before praise. At school, he struggled to fit in. He was bullied, mocked for his accent and background, singled out for being different. The contradiction arrived early and stayed. At home, achievement was assumed. Outside, difference was punished. That tension taught him something subtle and dangerous. Approval did not come from belonging. It came from being indisputable. As a teenager, he found performance not as escape, but as structure. Acting offered rules. It offered control. If he prepared enough, if he worked harder than anyone else, the outcome could be managed. On stage, effort translated into authority. Respect could be earned without asking for it. Performance became less about expression and more about certainty, a way to make the ground feel stable. He learned to associate safety with precision, affection with results, calm with preparation. Love felt conditional, arriving only when something exceptional had been delivered. There was little room for being average in that equation, little tolerance for unfinished work. Over time, this logic embedded itself quietly. Self-worth began to mirror output. Identity began to attach itself to performance. When he entered formal training, these tendencies didn't soften. They sharpened. He gravitated toward methods that promised total immersion and absolute control. He wasn't interested in charm. He wasn't interested in speed. He rejected ease instinctively, as if it were a threat. Discipline felt honest. Structure felt safe. Anything casual felt exposed. Teachers noticed the seriousness early. So did his peers. Some admired it. Others found it unsettling. Daniel did not treat acting as a craft to be practiced intermittently. He treated it as a state to be inhabited. He didn't learn how to perform a role and then leave it behind. He learned how to live inside a standard that didn't allow detachment. There were no public breakdowns, no dramatic confessions, no visible trauma to point to. What formed instead was quieter and more durable. A belief that excellence was the only secure position. A belief that anything less invited scrutiny. A belief that stopping meant slipping. Rest was not a skill he developed. Distance was not a boundary he trusted. By the time he stepped into the professional world, the architecture was already in place. The habits that would later be praised as rigor and seriousness had been rehearsed for years. The intensity that would be celebrated as commitment had been normalized early. The fear that would later be hidden behind discipline had been quietly reinforced by success. The industry would eventually reward all of it. It would call him meticulous, uncompromising, devoted. But those qualities didn't originate in ambition alone. They grew out of an early understanding that being good enough was never secure. That approval could be withdrawn. That silence carried judgment. This foundation did not create a reckless star. It created a controlled one. Someone who didn't chase attention, but demanded meaning. Someone who didn't fear effort, but feared inadequacy. Someone who learned to equate worth with precision and safety with control. As his career progressed, these beliefs wouldn't fade. They would be validated, reinforced, amplified by applause and awards. And when the world began celebrating the very traits that kept him tense, the system hardened further. Because when success confirms a logic that only perfection protects you, how do you ever learn to relax your grip? And if perfection becomes the only place that feels safe, what happens the moment maintaining it starts to cost more than you can pay? When Daniel Day-Lewis began his professional life, he did not move toward visibility. He moved inward. While others chased auditions, agents, and momentum, he chose a path that deliberately reduced noise. He went to the theater, not because it promised fame, but because it demanded discipline. The stage offered no edits, no safety nets, no chance to hide behind coverage or post-production. You either carried the role from beginning to end, or you failed in real time. That kind of pressure felt familiar. It matched the internal rules he had already learned to live by. Theater rewarded preparation and punished shortcuts. It exposed weakness immediately. For Daniel, that exposure felt honest. He immersed himself in systems that emphasized physical control, psychological rigor, and repetition until behavior became instinct. Movement was stripped of decoration. Emotion was stripped of excess. Every action had to earn its place. Nothing was allowed to be casual, and nothing was permitted to exist without intention. Even early on, people noticed how different his process was. He didn't arrive on set to get into character. He arrived already there, sometimes hours earlier, sometimes days. He stayed in the voice, the posture, the habits, even when no one was watching. This wasn't performative intensity. It was containment. He believed that breaking character diluted truth, and dilution felt like betrayal. As offers came in, he declined more than he accepted, not because the roles were small, but because they felt incomplete, not because they lacked prestige, but because they lacked weight. He avoided repetition. He avoided momentum. He avoided anything that could turn acting into routine. Agents struggled to manage someone who refused acceleration. Casting directors struggled to place someone who wouldn't compromise. But Daniel was not building a career in the traditional sense. He was building a standard, and that standard was internal. Each role had to justify the psychological cost it would demand. If it didn't require total commitment, it wasn't worth attempting. If it could be done safely, it didn't interest him. Over time, this logic hardened. The rules became stricter, the margins narrower. What began as discipline slowly turned into necessity. When he transitioned more fully into film, he didn't adapt to the industry's rhythm. He forced the rhythm to adapt to him. Schedules were adjusted. Directors negotiated around his process. Productions learned to accommodate the time he needed to disappear into preparation. He researched obsessively, trained physically beyond requirements, learned trades, accents, and routines until the line between research and identity blurred. The goal was never realism alone. It was inevitability. By the time the camera rolled, he wanted the character to feel like the only possible outcome. This approach slowed everything down. Years passed between projects. Visibility faded, then returned in sharp bursts. To the outside world, this looked like mystique. To him, it felt necessary. Too much exposure weakened the work. Too much familiarity dulled the edge. He believed that danger was essential to truth, and danger required distance. But danger has a cost. By refusing ease, he also refused recovery. By insisting on intensity, he denied himself rest. There was no place in his system for lightness, for roles that allowed play, for work that did not demand sacrifice. The private path protected him from mediocrity, but it also narrowed his world. Peers admired his seriousness. Some feared it. Very few could live inside it. He was not competing with others. He was competing against illusion, against the idea that repetition would turn meaning into habit. In an industry built on presence, he practiced withdrawal. In a culture that rewards accessibility, he chose opacity. This was not arrogance. It was control. He believed that too much of himself on display would weaken the work, and weakness was something he had learned to distrust. By the time success arrived in full force, the path was already set. The standards were fixed. The rules were non-negotiable. And while this private system would soon elevate him above his peers, it also ensured that when the spotlight finally found him, there would be no protective distance left between a man and the expectations he had built. Because when you design a life where only extremes feel legitimate, compromise begins to look like failure. And once you commit to a path that allows no margin, how do you step back without dismantling the identity that got you there? When the spotlight finally locked onto Daniel Day-Lewis, it didn't flicker, it stayed, and it intensified. His breakthrough with My Left Foot in 1989 did more than win an Academy Award. It rewrote the rules around what commitment was supposed to look like. Audiences didn't see a performance. They saw a transformation that refused to step out of character. Even when the cameras stopped, Hollywood celebrated the result and quietly ignored the method that produced it. From that moment on, his presence carried a different gravity. Projects didn't simply cast him. They deferred to him. Directors adjusted schedules. Sets reshaped themselves around his process. He was no longer an actor entering a production. He was a condition production had to accept. With each choice, the spotlight grew harsher. Praise turned absolute. Expectations stopped being reasonable. The industry began speaking about him in final terms. The greatest of his generation. Unrepeatable. Untouchable. These weren't compliments anymore. They were ceilings closing in. Every new role now arrived with a silent demand. It wasn't enough to be excellent again. He had to surpass the memory of himself. Then came There Will Be Blood in 2007, a performance built on control, precision, and cruelty so exact it unsettled audiences. The character did not invite empathy. It commanded attention through force. The second Academy Award followed, but something else arrived with it, a shift. Critics stopped comparing him to contemporaries. They compared him to history, to myths, to ideals that do not age well because they do not bend. From the outside, this looked like domination. Inside, it tightened frame. The room to experiment vanished. The permission to fail evaporated. Every gesture became a statement. Every pause was scrutinized. Every role carried the weight of a legacy that was still being written. The spotlight did not simply illuminate. It demanded maintenance. By the time Lincoln arrived in 2012, the pressure had reached a different register. The performance was restrained, controlled, almost invisible in its precision. A third Academy Award followed. 3 wins, 6 nominations, a record unmatched, validation complete. And yet, this was the moment when the cost became impossible to ignore. Success had hardened into obligation. Each project required total immersion, not because the role demanded it, but because the reputation did. The distance between the man and the work collapsed. There was no buffer left, no off switch, no place where performance ended and rest began. The spotlight, once a marker of achievement, became an interrogation lamp. Interviews grew rare. Public appearances thinned out. Gaps between films widened. From the industry's perspective, this looked like mystique. From a distance, it looked intentional, but the truth was quieter. The standard he had set no longer allowed recovery. To step back would look like decline. To choose something lighter would look like retreat. To fail would look like betrayal. So the work grew heavier, the preparation deeper, the isolation more complete. Each success reinforced the belief that intensity was the price of legitimacy, that suffering was proof of seriousness, that ease was a form of dishonesty. The spotlight rewarded this logic. Applause followed, awards followed, and with each cycle, the expectations tightened again. The peak did not feel like a place to stand. It felt like a slope with no plateau. You either climbed higher or you slipped. What the audience saw was mastery sustained. What they didn't see was how narrow the path had become, how little margin remained for being human, how success had quietly rewritten the rules of survival. Because when excellence stops being a pursuit and becomes a requirement, the spotlight no longer celebrates you. It monitors you. And when the world decides that perfection is what you are for, where does that leave the person who has to live behind it? If every performance must justify the legend that came before, how long can anyone keep standing in that light before it starts to burn? By the time Daniel Day-Lewis reached what the world called absolute mastery, the internal structure holding that mastery together had already begun to fracture. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but through accumulation, through repetition, through a system that no longer allowed recovery. There were no headlines about addiction, no tabloid photos, no public meltdowns. That absence itself became part of the illusion. From the outside, his life looked controlled, disciplined, almost ascetic. Inside, the pressure was no longer episodic. It was constant. Every role now arrived carrying the full weight of his reputation. Every decision felt irreversible. Every project demanded total immersion, not because the character required it, but because the standard did. The danger was subtle. His method no longer served the work alone. It began serving fear. Fear of dilution, fear of repetition, fear of being ordinary even once. The rules he had built to protect quality hardened into constraints. Preparation expanded until it consumed months. Research turned obsessive. Physical training pushed past necessity. Psychological immersion extended far beyond the set. With There Will Be Blood, the line blurred further. The character was cold, controlling, and emotionally predatory. Daniel didn't just perform those traits. He inhabited them. He carried the posture, the voice, the emotional temperature with him. Colleagues described an atmosphere of distance, not hostility, but something more unsettling, a sense that the character had not been put down at the end of the day. This wasn't recklessness. It was consistency taken too far. His system did not include decompression. There was no ritual for exiting a role, no boundary between intensity and rest. The same rigor that created brilliance also prevented release. The work demanded everything, and the system had no mechanism for giving anything back. As time passed, the gaps between films grew longer. Public appearances became rare. Interviews thinned out, then nearly vanished. To the industry, this read as mystique. To critics, it felt intentional. But beneath that interpretation was exhaustion, not the kind that sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from sustaining vigilance without pause. When Lincoln arrived, the collapse accelerated quietly. The role demanded restraint, moral gravity, historical responsibility. Daniel approached it with the same totality he always had, living inside the voice, the posture, the internal rhythm of the character. But this time, the weight lingered longer. The role did not live cleanly. The distance between performance and self narrowed to the point of disappearance. He had reached a place where every performance felt existential, where each role was no longer a challenge, but a referendum, not just on his skill, but on his worth. Failure was no longer an option, not because the industry wouldn't forgive it, but because his internal system wouldn't survive it. The praise didn't help. Awards didn't relieve pressure. They reinforced it. Applause confirmed the logic that intensity was necessary, that sacrifice was proof, that ease was dishonesty. The world rewarded the very behaviors that were quietly eroding his capacity to continue. And because there was no visible collapse, no dramatic signal, there was no interruption, no intervention, no moment where the system was forced to stop. It simply kept escalating, demanding deeper immersion, longer preparation, greater isolation. At this stage, the dark side was no longer an external force. It wasn't the industry. It wasn't the roles. It was the internal contract he had signed long ago. a contract that equated seriousness with suffering and legitimacy with exhaustion. The question was no longer whether the system could produce greatness. It clearly could. The question had shifted to something far more dangerous. How long can a person live inside a standard that allows no margin, no rest, and no imperfection before the system itself becomes a threat? By the time the applause faded after Lincoln, the internal damage was no longer theoretical. It was structural. What had once been a demanding system now felt unsustainable. The preparation took longer. The recovery took longer. The sense of return never fully arrived. Roles no longer ended when filming stopped. They lingered, coloring mood, posture, and perception. The separation between work and life, always thin, had nearly disappeared. The industry saw restraint. Inside, there was depletion. Daniel did not speak publicly about collapse. There were no confessions, no dramatic exits, no visible breakdowns. Instead, there was silence. Years passed without projects. Invitations came and went. Scripts were read and set aside, not because they were unworthy, but because each one implied the same cost. Total immersion, total exposure, total risk. The question was no longer whether he could deliver. It was whether the delivery would take something irretrievable with it. What made the situation more dangerous was that nothing was wrong in the conventional sense. His reputation was intact, his finances secure, his health outwardly stable. There was no external crisis forcing a pause. That meant the decision, if it came, would have to be internal, voluntary, absolute. The internal collapse was not dramatic. It was logical. The standard he built no longer allowed variation. He could not choose a smaller role without undermining the legend. He could not choose a lighter role without questioning the seriousness that defined him. He could not fail without dismantling the identity that had been reinforced for decades. Every path forward led to escalation. More preparation, more isolation, more immersion, and less room to breathe. At some point, the calculus shifted. The cost was no longer measured against artistic reward, but against personal survival, not physical survival. Psychological continuity, the ability to remain himself outside of roles, the ability to exist without being consumed by the next transformation. When the announcement came in 2017, it was brief and unemotional. He would retire from acting permanently. No conditions, no future exceptions, no farewell tour. The language was precise, final. There was no attempt to soften the message or reassure the industry. This was not a break. It was an exit. The reaction was disbelief. Critics speculated. Fans waited for the reversal. Hollywood treated it like a pause disguised as resolve. But the clarity of the decision suggested otherwise. This was not a moment of doubt. It was a conclusion of a long internal process. What the public interpreted as withdrawal was, in truth, containment, a boundary place where none had existed before, a refusal to let the standard demand more than the person could give. The same rigor that once drove him deeper into roles was now being used to step away from them. There was no sense of loss expressed publicly, because the loss had already been processed privately. The collapse did not arrive at the end. It had been unfolding for years. The retirement simply acknowledged it. This was not a rejection of acting. It was a rejection of the version of acting that his system required. A system where seriousness equaled suffering, where excellence demanded erosion, where identity had to be sacrificed repeatedly to maintain status. By walking away, he disrupted the narrative the industry prefers, that greatness must be sustained at all costs, that mastery obligates continuation, that stopping equals failure. Instead, he offered a quieter, more unsettling proposition, that survival can be a form of success, that restraint can be an act of strength, that stepping away before collapse is not weakness, but recognition. The dark side of Daniel Day-Lewis's career was never excess. It was discipline without margin, commitment without release, a system that produced unmatched work, and then asked for more than it could safely take. In the end, the collapse did not destroy him. It redirected him. And the most radical choice he ever made was not how deeply he entered his roles, but when he decided he would not enter another one at all. The decision to leave acting did not arrive as an impulse. It arrived as resolution. By the time Daniel Day-Lewis made it public, The work of leaving had already been done in private. Years of silence had preceded the announcement. Years of scripts declined. Years of watching familiar cycle approach again, and choosing not to step into it. What made the turning point difficult to read was its calm. There was no visible breaking point. No single role that went wrong. No scandal to explain the exit. The industry kept looking for a trigger, because it understands collapse. It does not understand restraint. But this was not collapse. It was recognition. He understood something before it became irreversible, that the system he had built, while capable of producing brilliance, could not be sustained without consuming the person inside it. The next role would not simply be another challenge. It would require deeper immersion, longer preparation, greater isolation. The escalation was inevitable. The standard allowed no other direction. So he chose to stop before the damage became permanent. In 2017, the statement was brief. He would no longer act. He offered no elaborate explanation, no retrospective justification, no attempt to control the narrative. The finality was deliberate. He knew that leaving a door open would keep the system alive. This was not a sabbatical. It was a boundary. For the first time in decades, he made a decision that did not serve the work. It served the person. This was a different kind of rebirth, one that did not involve reinvention or public redemption. There was no comeback story waiting on the horizon. There was no alternative career announced to fill the vacuum. He did not replace acting with something equally consuming. He replaced it with absence. That absence was not emptiness. It was space. Space to exist without preparation. Space to move without performance. Space to live without the expectation of transformation. In stepping away, he refused a mythology that surrounds mastery. The idea that once you reach the summit, you must remain there. That excellence obligates repetition. That walking away diminishes what came before. His choice suggested the opposite. That knowing when to stop may be the final expression control. This was not a rejection of discipline. It was discipline redirected. The same seriousness that once drove him into characters was now applied to preservation. He treated leaving with the same rigor he had applied to acting, completely, without negotiation, without sentimentality. The rebirth did not come with applause. It came with quiet, with normalcy, with a life no longer structured around immersion and extraction. For someone whose identity had long been fused with performance, this was not an easy transition, but it was a necessary one. The industry continued to speculate. Offers continued to arrive. The legend continued to grow in his absence, but the turning point had already passed. He was no longer negotiating with expectation. He had stepped outside of it. What emerged was not a new public identity, but a private one. A man no longer required to prove seriousness through suffering. A person allowed to exist without being measured against his own past. In choosing to stop, Daniel Day-Lewis did not abandon greatness. He protected it. He prevented the erosion that comes from staying too long, from repeating oneself under pressure, from allowing excellence to harden into obligation. This turning point was not dramatic, because it did not need to be. Its power came from clarity, from finality, from the refusal to let the system decide for him. And in that sense, the rebirth was not about becoming someone else. It was about reclaiming the ability to be anyone at all. Because sometimes the bravest transformation is not stepping deeper into what you are celebrated for, but stepping away before it finishes defining you completely. After stepping away from the screen, Daniel Day-Lewis did something the industry rarely witnesses. He stayed gone. No interviews explaining the choice in detail. No carefully managed reappearances. No attempts to reshape the narrative. The silence was not a strategy. It was the point. Life after acting did not come with a replacement identity. He did not trade one consuming vocation for another. He did not become a public mentor, a commentator, or a symbol of withdrawal. He chose anonymity, routine, and distance from the structures that once defined him. For someone whose working life had been built around total immersion, this restraint was radical. The absence sharpened the legacy. Without new performances to recalibrate opinion, the existing work solidified. My left foot, There Will Be Blood, Lincoln. They stopped being recent achievements and became reference points, benchmarks, standards others were measured against, often unfairly. Younger actors were praised by being compared to him. Veterans were evaluated by how close they came. The comparisons persisted precisely because there was nothing new to dilute the memory. In the industry, his name became shorthand for seriousness, for rigor, for an almost unreachable level of commitment. But there was also a subtle shift. Admiration mixed with caution. His career began to function as a warning as much as an aspiration, a reminder of what it cost to pursue excellence without compromise. What endured was not just the work, but the method. Acting schools discuss him as a case study. Directors spoke about adjusting entire productions around his process. Critics debated whether such intensity should be emulated or tempered. His influence did not fade with absence. It spread through conversation, imitation, and resistance. Outside the industry, the legacy felt quieter but deeper. To audiences, he remained frozen at his peak, not because he died or fell, but because he stopped. The image never aged. The decline never arrived. The familiar arc of diminishing returns was never completed. In a culture accustomed to watching greatness erode over time, his decision interrupted the pattern. This interruption gave his career a different shape. Instead of a long curve with a visible descent, it became a series of precise points, each one deliberate, each one complete. The work did not ask to be contextualized by what came after. It stood on its own. There was also a moral legacy embedded in the choice, an implicit statement that identity does not need to be exhausted to be validated, that walking away can preserve meaning rather than diminish it, that absence can protect what presence might eventually weaken. He did not claim this lesson publicly. He did not articulate it as philosophy. It emerged through action, through refusal, through consistency, in a system that rewards endless output. He demonstrated the power of limits in an industry that equates relevance with visibility. He showed that impact can persist without participation. The legacy was not just about how he acted, but about when he stopped acting. And because he left on his own terms, the work was spared the slow erosion of necessity. There were no roles taken to maintain status, no performances delivered out of obligation, no compromises made to satisfy momentum. The legacy remained concentrated, intact, and difficult to replicate. In that sense, life after acting did not diminish Daniel Day-Lewis's place in history. It clarified it. It turned his career into a closed body of work with clear edges and unmistakable intent. A reminder that sometimes the strongest influence comes not from what you add, but from what you refuse to give away. The story of Daniel Day-Lewis does not end with applause, scandal, or decline. It ends with restraint. And that is precisely why it unsettles. In a culture trained to read disappearance as failure, his silence refuses to fit the expected shape. There is no downfall to dissect, no redemption arc to wait for. Only a man who recognized the limits of his own system and chose not to cross them. For decades, excellence had been his shelter. Precision had been his protection. Discipline had been the language through which he proved worth, earned safety, and maintained control. The world applauded this structure because it produced results. Awards followed. Records followed. Praise hardened into myth. But myths are unforgiving. They do not allow rest. They demand consistency without mercy. What makes this ending uncomfortable is that it offers no villain. Hollywood did not destroy him. Fame did not corrupt him. Success did not rot him from the inside. The pressure came from something far more familiar. A belief that worth must always be justified, that seriousness requires sacrifice, that stopping means losing. By walking away, he challenged that belief quietly but completely. He suggested that mastery does not obligate endurance, that knowing when to stop may be the final act of authorship over one's life, that protecting the self can matter more than feeding the legend. There is no lesson spelled out here, no instruction offered. Only a mirror held up to an industry and to anyone who equates identity with output. His absence asks a question that lingers longer than any performance. If perfection demands everything, how much of yourself are you willing to give before you ask what remains? And if the world only values you for what you produce, who are you allowed to be once you choose to stop? Daniel Day-Lewis left before the answers were forced, before erosion could masquerade as commitment, before survival required self-erasure. In doing so, he preserved not just a body of work, but a boundary. And perhaps that is the most unsettling legacy of all. Not that he was the greatest, but that he knew greatness was not worth keeping at any cost.